Hey football fans, and welcome to the Coordinator Project. In this video we're looking at USC's 2020 defense under Todd Orlando, but I'll be hitting play callers from all over the country throughout the offseason, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to get notified whenever a new breakdown posts. Orlando's been a coordinator for 16 years now, and schematically his career breaks down into two 8-year phases. For most of the first phase, from 2005 to 2010, he was the defensive coordinator at Connecticut under head coach Randy Edsall. After the 2010 season, Edsall left Connecticut to become Maryland's head coach, and Orlando went down to Florida International, where he spent 2 years calling the defense for Mario Cristobal, who's now the head coach at Oregon. During this first stage of his career, Orlando based out of a 4-3 defense, spending most of the game with 4 down linemen at the first level and 3 linebackers stacked behind them. This was the defense that he'd come up in as a position coach at Connecticut, where, before becoming the defensive coordinator, he coached linebackers under Hank Hughes. During this period, Orlando, like every defensive coordinator, had to deal with the rise of the up-tempo spread offense, and he had to figure out how to adjust to the new challenges that it presented. His first response was to combat tempo by simplifying his defense, as he said in an interview with The Athletic. When they made the decision to go up-tempo, or whatever it was, spread, zone read, I think we all sat back as defensive guys and said, you know what, let's get lined up, and if we have to play 1 or 2 things, let's do that. I think offenses looked at that and said, we literally have them playing 1 or 2 things. We've got a wide-open playbook. Orlando soon recognized that you couldn't beat a good creative offense by simplifying and playing scared at tempo. He was looking to change up his scheme, and after the 2012 season, he got just the change that he needed. After that year, Cristobal was fired by FAU, putting Orlando back on the market, and at that point he was hired by Matt Wells, who'd just been promoted to head coach at Utah State. That 2013 season ushered in the second half of Orlando's schematic history and gave birth to the defense that he's still running today. To understand where Orlando's 2020 defense came from, then, we need to look back at what was going on at Utah State in the year before his arrival. In that year, Matt Wells was Utah State's offensive coordinator, working under defensively minded head coach Gary Anderson. Like Orlando, Anderson's Aggies had been basing out of a 4-3 defense as recently as 2010, but by 2011 he was starting to transition them to a 3-4, looking to combat the spread by taking a defensive lineman off the field and replacing him with a linebacker, giving him 3 down linemen at the first level and then 4 linebackers, with 2 outside linebackers manning the edges and 2 inside linebackers stacked at the second level. As a part of this defensive reimagination, in 2012 Anderson hired a young defensive coordinator who was looking for work after his head coach had been fired from his last job. That coordinator was Dave Aranda, who's obviously gone on to become one of the hottest defensive coaches in the country. Aranda was only at Utah State for 1 year, and Orlando never worked with him, so there's nothing like a mentor-mentee relationship here, but Aranda's legacy at Utah State's had a huge impact on Orlando's career. As for Matt Wells, after being on a staff with Aranda for a year, he knew that he wanted to replicate that style when he got to make his own defensive coordinator hire. Here's what he had to say about Aranda's defense and its subsequent importance for Orlando. Just with odd fronts, multiple fronts, man pressures, zone pressures, false pressures as he calls them, it was difficult to go against in terms of IDing the front and pressure, and with the linebackers that are pressuring, it creates doubt in a quarterback and center's head. We carried it over, and after he left, Todd Orlando learned it and put his spin on it. There's a lot of Dave Aranda influence at Utah State and now at Texas Tech. Aranda's defense, then, was the model that Orlando was following when he came to Utah State, and it meshed perfectly with his desire to attack those hurry-up, no-huddle spread offenses that we talked about earlier. This ushered in the second half of his schematic career and gave birth to much of the package that he's still running today at USC. Let's start to break down this defense by looking at how Orlando creates confusion using those false pressures and blitzing linebackers that Wells mentioned. On this play, we'll see Orlando running something that Aranda calls a creeper blitz. The key feature of this kind of blitz is that it'll bring pressure from at least one non-traditional pass rusher, like a linebacker or a defensive back, and will then drop an expected pass rusher into coverage, usually an edge defender. On this play, that strategy is going to allow the Trojans to get a completely unblocked blitzer coming off the edge, all while bringing just a 4-man pass rush. So, how are they going to do that? First, USC is going to isolate the right guard and the right tackle here by getting rid of the center. To do that, they're going to take this nose tackle who's lined up directly across from him, and they're going to angle him away from the side of the blitz. As we can see when we run this play forward, when that nose tackle angles to the weak side, the center goes with him, isolating the right guard and right tackle to the right side of the formation. From there, Orlando's simply going to bring 3 rushers to outnumber those 2 blockers. First, this outside linebacker on the edge is going to stab all the way down inside, ultimately using up the block of the right guard. Next, they're going to use this linebacker to blitz the right tackle, occupying his attention and preventing him from getting outside to the edge. With the right tackle and right guard occupied in this way, the Trojans are then free to blitz a nickelback off the edge, giving him a free run at the quarterback, hurrying his throw and getting a knockdown. The quarterback actually does a nice job of getting rid of the ball here, but a good physical play by the safety is enough to jar it loose, letting the Trojans get off the field on 3rd and 6. The key here, though, and the thing that makes this a creeper blitz, is that while all of these linebackers and defensive backs are blitzing to the strong side, this B backer, who's kind of a hybrid outside linebacker defensive end position, like the stud that we saw in the Boise State School of Defense, is dropping out into coverage. When that guy drops, the Ducks are playing 3-on-1 against that nose tackle, who's the only pass rusher to this side. And meanwhile, they've got just 2 blockers to the right side, and those guys are stuck going up against 3 pass rushers. That's how you end up with a completely unblocked defender with just a 4-man pass rush. This kind of thing isn't original to Aranda in Orlando, and it really fits into the whole safe pressure concept that's been around for decades in the zone blitz world. What makes this really effective in Orlando's system, though, is that he runs this kind of thing with all sorts of hybrid players who he can ask to execute both rush and coverage responsibilities from play to play. In 2020, Orlando's base defense was one of those hybrid nickel defenses like the one that we saw from Andy Avalos, with 3 down linemen, that hybrid defensive end outside linebacker position that Orlando calls the B backer, and 2 inside linebackers behind them all at the second level. What really interests me about his defense isn't so much the base package, though, but rather all of the nickel, dime, and even more exotic looks that he uses to attack spread offenses. And in these packages, he's channeling some of the defenses that he saw in the Big 12 as the defensive coordinator at Texas. On the play that we just saw, for example, the Trojans were in a dime package with just 1 defensive lineman, that nose tackle, on the field. Everybody else in the box was a linebacker, and so all of those guys had the skill set to either blitz or drop into coverage. As we'll soon see, the sheer number of guys who can do both in this kind of grouping gives Orlando a lot of options and makes it hard for the offense to ID where the pressure is coming from. Talking about all of these options brings me to one of Orlando's most interesting philosophical positions. Orlando likes to draw a comparison between his defense and the way that offenses try to attack. For example, if an offense likes to run an inside zone rushing play, they might call it 12 times a game, but they'll run it out of several different formations, backfield sets, motions, and so on. For the offense, it's always the same blocking scheme, but for the defense, it looks different every time. Orlando wants to bring that approach to the defensive side of the ball, and we can get a good example of that by looking at another one of his blitz calls. This blitz is going to be very structurally similar to the last one that we studied. On that blitz, we saw that the nose tackle was angling away from the blitz to draw the attention of the center, 2 inside rushers occupied the right guard and right tackle, and then a nickelback blitzed off the edge to outnumber the protection. On this play, he's running essentially the same pressure, but it's dressed up very differently. First of all, on this play, USC is running something even lighter than a dime package, with just 2 defensive linemen and 2 linebackers on the field. Everyone else in the box is a defensive back, and Orlando is more than happy to use all of his nickelbacks and safeties as kind of defensive back-linebacker hybrids. On this play, just like the last one, the pressure is going to come from the strong side of the formation down here at the bottom of the screen where Washington State has 3 receivers. Just like on the last play, the nose tackle is going to angle away from the blitz, and this edge defender, who's an outside linebacker in this case, is going to drop into coverage, so this is another creeper blitz. Unlike the last play, however, the Trojans aren't going to rely on one of these walked-out defensive backs to provide the edge pressure. Instead, they've got a defensive end and an outside linebacker both lined up at the first level, and both of those guys are going to stab down inside, and this makes them the 2 inside rushers to occupy the right guard and right tackle. Meanwhile, this safety, who's lined up where a linebacker had been on the previous play, is going to wrap around to the outside, and this lets him become the edge rusher and creates a one-on-one matchup with the running back. That blitzer's not unblocked on this play because Washington State's left a running back into block, but this is a favorable matchup for that blitzing safety, and he's still able to affect the quarterback. Meanwhile, since none of these outside defensive backs are involved in the rush, they're free to focus on playing tight man coverage on their receivers. When the quarterback gets rushed by the blitz, he makes a bad throw that leads his receiver back across the line to gain, allowing the Trojans to get off the field on 3rd and 1. All of this blitzing gives Orlando the reputation for being aggressive, but honestly, he might earn that reputation more with his coverage package than with his blitz package. I broke down USC's games against Oregon and Washington State, and in those games he played a lot of aggressive man coverage no matter how many guys he was actually rushing. And when USC gave up big plays in those games, it could usually be traced back to this coverage strategy. Most of the time, it wasn't somebody getting beat in their man matchup, which is what you might normally expect for a big man team, but rather both Oregon and Washington State were able to find ways to use misdirection to put pressure on USC's man assignments. We'll see a good example of that right here. On this play, USC is running cover 0 in the red zone. That means that to the weak side here, this cornerback will be responsible for the wide receiver, and then this safety will be responsible for anything that might leak out to the backside from the running back or from this tight end coming across the formation from the opposite side. On this play, that tight end is in fact coming across the formation, and so the safety should be there to pick him up. This coverage is going to fail though, and so the question is, why couldn't either the cornerback or the safety get to that guy? The key is going to come from this wide receiver and from the cornerback who's assigned to cover him. After the snap, we see run action away from this side of the field, and we see that the wide receiver is going to crack back on that weak safety. Oregon's going to make this throw behind the line of scrimmage, which means that this block is going to be legal, and it'll prevent the safety from picking up the tight end as he works across the field. But what about the cornerback? To understand this, it's important to remember that he's manned up on his receiver, and so when that guy releases down inside, the cornerback has to run with him in case he's running some kind of inside or crossing route. When that guy cracks back on the safety, then he's able to take out two defenders. He takes out the safety with his block, and he takes out the cornerback who has to cover him in man. This lets the tight end get outside of the defense and down the sideline for a touchdown. When we think about big plays versus aggressive defenses, people often think of getting beat in coverage, but this kind of movement-based defense can get you into trouble in the run game as well. On this play, USC is running the same blitz that we've talked about throughout this video, and they're bringing it from the left side of the screen here. So the nose tackle is going to angle away from the blitz, and the defensive end and walked-up defensive back here are going to stab down as the inside rushers. Here again, the Trojans have a safety playing this pseudo-linebacker role in the box, and he's going to wrap around the edge as the outside rusher. On this play, the problem's going to come from the execution of this defensive end right here, and this does a nice job of illustrating how stunt-heavy defenses can get into trouble in the run game. Before the snap, that defensive end is lined up in the B gap between the right guard and the right tackle. As the insidemost rusher in this stunt, though, he has to get across the face of the right guard to take away the A gap. Again, Orlando wants to use movement like this to make it hard for the offense to know where all of the defenders are going to end up after the snap. The problem here is that on this play, the defensive end doesn't get across the right guard's face. If we pause the play right here, we see that the right guard has stayed inside of him and is cutting him off in that A gap that he needs to control. This becomes doubly problematic when we remember that the safety here is scraping away from that gap to become an edge rusher. That means that USC isn't going to have a second-level defender who can get to this lane, and so once the running back gets away from the pressure in the backfield, he's got a clear path straight into the secondary. If you were to leave the safety stacked instead of scraping him to the edge, then he could still correct for the defensive end's execution or quote-unquote make him right no matter what he does. If the safety's still stacked at the second level here, then he can just gap exchange with the defensive end when he gets locked out by the right guard. Because the safety's also moving as a part of this stunt, though, there's nobody to correct for it when the defensive end can't get into his gap. The risks inherent in stunting and playing aggressive man coverage aren't all about the passing game then. Teams can also beat you with the run, and the screen game can be really effective against it as well. Alright, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, you might consider hitting the thumbs up button down below to like it. The more likes, the more YouTube will recommend these videos to other people, so it really helps to support the channel. Also, if there's a coordinator that you want to see on here, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Otherwise, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to get notified whenever a new breakdown goes up, and I'll see you here next time.